We break down President Trump's remarks at Davos and the reception that he received. We're also going to talk about the Keith Ellison origin story, how the Minnesota Attorney General got involved in so much corruption. We're also going to talk about a New York Times bombshell on what happened to climate change politics. All of that and so much more today on 10 Minute Drill.
Everybody get up, get up.
The story of America is the story of an adventure.
I can hear you. The rest of the world hears you.
We are a nation under God, and I believe God intended for us to be free.
Yesterday, President Trump turned a lot of heads with a lengthy speech at Davos.
In 1 year, our agenda has produced a transformation like America has not seen in over 100 years.
While he talked about a number of different issues that we're going to get into, one underlying theme of all of it was that Europe has changed.
Certain places in Europe are not even recognizable, frankly, anymore. They're not recognizable. And we can argue about it, but there's no argument.
Now, to begin with our analysis on this, he's right. Europe has changed. And in the last several years, we've seen in a lot of different ways how Europe has not been a reliable partner on a wide range of issues. For example, just this week, this story broke. Washington Reporter, Scoop, EU attempts to undermine President Trump's pro-growth policies on tech. This is from Matthew Foldy at the Washington Reporter detailing how the European Union's parliament is talking about ways to already undermine our trade deal on tech policy. We've talked here extensively about some of the non-trade barriers and regulations the Europeans have tried to drop on American companies to make a profit. Those are issues that President Trump directly dealt with in the European Union trade deal that they're now trying to undermine, according to new leaked documents. We've talked about European energy policies that included continuing to buy Russian oil and gas while demanding the rest of the world pay more money to fight against Russia. As Scott Bessent said,
we have Europe buying Russian oil still, 4 years later, they are financing the war against themselves.
And trying to enforce their overreaching anti-free speech standards on American companies and even on their own citizens on things they post on social media, which again does not feel like the Europe that shared so many values with us before. But one of the most important themes of President Trump's address was the future of Greenland.
People thought I would use force. I don't have to use force. I don't want to use force. I won't use force.
Now, as we talked about a little bit last week, there are a few legitimate reasons behind President Trump's push for the United States to play a greater role in Greenland. The fact primarily that it is a giant physical shield between Russia and the rest of the world, China as well. And President Trump has had a major focus on protecting the U.S. hemisphere, the Western hemisphere, from influence from around the world. But he did make a lot of European allies very nervous with any conversation about taking it by force. Just yesterday afternoon, he announced this.
Now, the president has posted this on Truth Social, quote, based on a very productive meeting that I've had with the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, we have formed the framework of a future deal with respect to Greenland and, in fact, the entire Arctic region.
Now, what that future framework of a deal entails, we will find out as we go. However, a lot of experts were pointing to the fact that President Trump's positioning and scaring people into believing that the United States might take Greenland by force was a part of a negotiating tactic to try and get the best deal possible. Now, you may ask if that's the best way to deal with our allies. The Wall Street Journal doesn't really think so. Here's what they say. The sad irony is that China and Russia may be the biggest winners, though Mr. Trump justifies his Greenland necessity in the name of deterring both. Canada's Prime Minister bent the knee to Xi Jinping last week, and Britain's Prime Minister is heading there this month. The EU and South American countries have struck a big free trade pact. So what the Wall Street Journal is pointing out there is one of the main reasons we've wanted Greenland is to keep out Chinese influence, while at the same time, Canada, our closest neighbor, has invited in more Chinese influence into our hemisphere with their own free trade deals and talks. So while President Trump has taken an aggressive tone on Greenland, one of the negative impacts of that is that it's actually potentially pushing some of our closest allies to work more closely with China while they might view the United States as a less reliable trade partner. At this same time, this report from Breitbart, top secret, thousands of Chinese pilots are trained every year in California and Arizona, strengthening the CCP's military power. That is from national security expert Peter Schweitzer, who has a new book about the threats that America faces from China. China expert Michael Lucci, the founder of State Armor, tweeted this about it. Peter Schweitzer exposes an insane reality. American flight schools are training China's military pilots. The CCP disguises military pilots as civilians and sends them to schools in Arizona and California. Communist China exploits our openness to attack our security. So again, the threat from China remains the biggest in the world. Even as we focus on ways of using countries and territories like Greenland to bolster ourselves, we also have to be mindful of what countries in our own hemisphere are doing in terms of partnering with China, giving them more access to the regions around us. And I would just note that as Susie Wiles was landing in Davos with President Trump, she told the media that President Trump will not be taking very many more international trips as he looks to focus on midterms. On Tuesday, the FBI announced that they had issued subpoenas to a number of high-ranking officials in Minnesota, including Governor Tim Walz, Attorney General Keith Ellison, and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey.
The FBI has apparently just served subpoenas to several officials here in Minneapolis, including members of the office of Governor Tim Walz.
Fox News reported, these subpoenas are part of a federal investigation into alleged conspiracy to coerce or obstruct federal law enforcement during ongoing ICE operations in Minnesota. Meanwhile, independent journalist Nick Shirley testified before the House of Representatives yesterday.
Governor Walz has said he's been fighting fraud in Minnesota since 2019 and said the buck stops with him. However, how long would it take for you to notice $1 million leaving your bank account and not knowing where it's going? That's essentially what had been happening in Minnesota for years as billions of dollars has been misplaced.
We've talked extensively about Keith Ellison and his role in this fraud scandal. But the reality is, Keith Ellison's role in fraud, particularly working with the Somali community, goes back much further than this. So today we're going to talk a tiny bit more about Keith Ellison's origin story. Keith Ellison served in Congress for a little over a decade, but is only known for passing one bill. And here he is talking about that issue.
Well, first of all, let me say Salam Alaikum, Ilyas. It's good to be here with you with the Mogadishu Times. The discussion focused on how we can keep money flowing to Somalia.
As Ellison just said there, his priority of the one bill that he passed during his time in Congress was about how he could get more money flowing to Somalia. And this was with the Mogadishu Times. Now, they had talked about the fact that some banks were getting skittish over those remittances, which is how people in the United States send money to other countries, in a lot of cases, developing countries, to family members back home and things like that. And Ellison explains why they were skittish.
Worried that they could end up being prosecuted on a criminal basis or having the regulations come on them, because recently a lady named Amina Ali was convicted of gathering money for Al-Shabaab and then using a service to transmit that money.
Now, he mentions there a woman named Amina Ali who was arrested. Now, you may be asking, why was she arrested? She was arrested for sending material support to Al-Shabaab, the terror network. So as banks were getting nervous about remittances because they were tied to funding terrorism, Keith Ellison passed a bill to make it easier for these banks to get around federal oversight for those remittances. So he has been involved in trying to get more money into the Somali community and then back to Somalia his entire professional life. And one important part of this Minnesota fraud discussion that hasn't gotten enough attention is the human cost of it. Bethany Mandel had a great piece in the Washington Examiner looking into the fact that this fraud isn't just monopoly money disappearing. Every dollar that goes into a fraudulent scheme is one less dollar that goes to support a person who actually needs these programs they were being scammed from, like Medicaid and things like that. As billions of taxpayer dollars were siphoned out of programs meant to provide food, medical care, housing assistance, and support for people with disabilities, state officials ignored repeated warnings, whistleblowers were sidelined, and the people these programs were supposed to serve were often left without care altogether. Every dollar lost to abuse is a dollar not spent on real people whose health, safety, and stability depend on those services. When the government fails to stop fraud early on, the result is not just waste, but neglect, abandonment, and in some cases, preventable tragedy. Local investigative reporting has documented repeated instances in which Medicaid providers billed Minnesota for services that were never delivered, sometimes to people they never even met. In one particular harrowing case, a vulnerable adult enrolled in a Medicaid funding home care program was found dead at home, unattended, despite records showing the state had paid for hours of daily supervision. On paper, comprehensive care had been provided. In reality, no one showed up. So again, a person died because they were a part of a program that instead of actually serving him as the money flowed to the people that were intended to serve him, they actually were checking a box saying they provided hours of daily care and supervision and hadn't checked on this person for weeks when he was found dead. So again, we're going to learn more and more about the human costs of this fraud, and the investigations into people like Keith Ellison are far from over. We talked a lot this week about Don Lemon and his role in leading a crazy protest into a church and shutting down a worship service, chasing people to their cars, etc. We wanted to introduce another person that was heavily involved in that. From Fox News, the far-left agitator who organized the Minnesota church storming raked in over $1 million from anti-poverty nonprofit. Now, this is a big, deep background into Nekima Armstrong. Nekima Levy Armstrong, who was one of the organizers of the storming of a Minnesota church to protest ICE on Sunday, raked in over $1 million during 6 years leading a Minneapolis civil rights nonprofit that addresses anti-poverty issues. Armstrong, whose website identifies her as a civil rights lawyer and scholar activist, helped to organize the storming of City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota on Sunday. What's notable in this reporting is that she runs a nonprofit focused on fighting poverty, but she made more money from it than they gave out in grants to poverty programs. It is incredible how lucrative it is to be a protester and agitator in a place like Minnesota. Armstrong's also been heavily involved in some of the activities terrorizing stores like Target to pressure them to take more intense political positions. For our You Can't Make It Up segment today, the Daily Caller has a very interesting piece about insurance companies. Insurers bragged about being woke while bilking taxpayers. Even as Americans grapple with rising health insurance premiums, growing out-of-pocket costs, and an increase in claims denials, many of the nation's largest insurers and their executives are spending time and resources promoting gender ideology and corporate diversity, equity, and inclusion programs. Premiums are up, denials are up, but so are woke politics. And this is a major problem you're going to see as we continue to have this healthcare conversation about why people are having to spend so much money on healthcare while outcomes and actual quality of service and care is drastically going down. One reason, because insurance companies that are charging you insane amounts of money are also funding their own involvement in incredibly political programs like this. That is all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us on 10 Minute Drill. Please like, subscribe, leave a review, tell your friends, and we will see you next week.